The first video I did was about anxiety and the different types, but that was just a video on anxiety in general, and I didn't have a lot of time to go into the different types of anxiety, of the phenomena of anxiety, if you will, because it's so prevalent in modern society, but it can manifest itself in so many different forms. For example, we have anorexia, eating disorders, and on the flip side of that, another eating disorder would be excessive overeating, which leads to weight gain, and anxiety attacks in general. You know, it's a very complicated subject, and I want to talk tonight about obsessive compulsive disorder, which obviously is a type of anxiety. And each different type of anxiety has its own unique set of challenges, of symptoms, of things that the person that suffers with it has to deal with. And OCD, I think, is probably the most common type of anxiety that people struggle with nowadays. And it's so common that a lot of people suffer from it, but not too terribly badly, not to the point where it paralyzes them or keeps them from leading a normal life or whatever. And so we often make OCD into a joke, you know, like people say, oh, my OCD is really acting up, you know, I got to go wash my hands again. And, you know, it can be like a funny character quirk, like, you know, oh, my best friend, he's out there, you know, washing his hands again or whatever. But people who suffer from obsessive compulsive disorder know that it can be a joke, but it isn't always a joke. And there are... for the people who suffer from extreme cases, there's nothing funny about it. I mean, it can rob you of your life. And the common misconception when we talk about obsessive compulsive disorder, the OCD, that's usually synonymous with hand washing and fear of germs. And yeah, that's a big one. And a lot of people suffer from that. And if you're watching this tonight and you suffer from OCD, you'll know what I'm talking about. But OCD comes in all kinds of different forms, and it's very pernicious that way. So you can have somebody who, you know, washes their hands every time they touch something. You know, if they come in contact with a surface, they have to wash and scrub their hands. And what's interesting is that so many people who suffer from that will wash their hands and wash their hands and wash their hands. And it's like Lady Macbeth, you know, no matter how much they scrub, they can't get their hands clean, or they don't feel clean. And so people struggle with that. And I mean, but it can take different forms as well. Like, for example, you know, you see the rug on the floor and it's not quite straight. It's not perfect. It's not lined up right. And so you get down on your hands and knees and you will just spend 10 minutes trying to get that rug exactly right. And it's that quest for perfection. So OCD is very prevalent. And like I said earlier, it might be the most common form of anxiety. So we're going to talk about that tonight. And first of all, let me get back to the root of anxiety. And I've talked about this. I pretty much started every video that I've done on mental health with my introduction is that the premise here from all the material I've read, books about mental health problems, is that humans are still hardwired to live in the wilderness, to live in our primordial state, you know, to live in small tribes, to live, you know, on the desert and in the African plains, to fight predators, to hunt for our food, to gather, to be hunter-gatherers. And civilization is the quirk. Civilization is the thing that our minds are not used to and are still not ready for. Even after thousands of years, our minds have not developed and caught up with technology and with just the very idea of a building that you live in, of schools and, you know, workplaces and things like that. I mean, all those are new. And the basic things that we suffer with, I really believe that the root cause of all anxiety goes back to survival. Anxiety is, by definition, a derangement or something messed up in your internal survival mechanisms. So when your survival mechanisms, when you're in danger, are designed to give you a boost of energy. Like, you know, your brain will send the signal to the renal gland that's above the kidney, which is where adrenaline is produced. And so that boost of adrenaline is there to get you to run away from a lion or to, you know, escape any kind of predator or to hunt down prey or whatever. I mean, we all have these things in us. But a healthy, happy, normal childhood, a normal upbringing will lead you, you'll have a healthy ability to tell danger, what's safe from what's dangerous. Unfortunately, with anxiety, what's going on is that your mind isn't able to process what's safe from what's dangerous. So you can actually suffer from, it's like your internal body mechanisms are telling you that you're in danger and that you're going to die, and it gives you that adrenaline boost, and it's trying to get you to run away from a predator, but there is no predator. You're perfectly safe, and it causes this feeling of inner turmoil, this feeling that I'm going to die, this drive to do something but not know what it is. And so obsessive compulsive disorder is a way we cope with that. So anxiety is the problem. Anxiety is the root cause, and it manifests itself in different forms. And if you look very closely, all these mental illnesses that people struggle with actually have to do in some way, shape, or form with survival. So for example, people who overeat, well, you have to eat to survive. And so their survival mechanisms, their anxiety is telling them, you've got to eat, you've got to eat, you've got to eat, or you'll starve to death. And they'll keep eating and keep eating. And no matter how much they eat, they're never satisfied. They never feel that craving until they, gain weight, until they get ridiculously, morbidly obese. And so that can be one problem. But with obsessive compulsive disorder, it tends to focus on, again, these are things that we need to do to survive. That's what's so dangerous. That's what's so terrible about anxiety, is that these are things we need to do to survive. The hoarder, for example, it is something you need to do to survive, to hoard and gather resources. And in the animal kingdom, the squirrels do it and mammals do it. You gotta hoard up resources. So there's something in our brain that drives us towards survival. We got to reach out and we got to grab those resources. Now, with OCD, we're talking about a lot of different things, but one of them is the desire for perfection, the desire for things to be neat, to be in order, or it could be cleanliness, because we need to be clean to survive. I mean, if we don't keep ourselves clean and have good hygiene, we could die of infection. And there's mechanisms in our minds and in our bodies that are driving us to clean ourselves to prevent that from happening. But the problem is, with OCD, it goes out of control. It goes haywire. Like there's some kind of problem in your nervous system, in your development, that makes you unable to tell when the danger is past. And so what happens is OCD is very ritualistic. Like there's something almost ritual-like about it, where the person who suffers from it, they aren't able to tell that they're safe, that they're not in danger, and their brain tells them that something totally harmless is dangerous and could kill them. So, for example, if I wash my hands, I'm safe. It's okay. It's a normal practice. But my brain can't process danger normally, so it will tell me, you got to keep washing your hands because you didn't get all the germs. And so I'll keep washing my hands. But my brain doesn't know how to shut that off. So it'll keep telling me, wash your hands more because you still didn't kill all of the germs. And no matter how many times I do this, I could scrub my hands till they're bleeding, and my survival mechanisms are still telling me, you didn't kill all the germs, you got to keep washing your hands until, like I said, you rub your hands raw, they're bleeding, they're dried and cracked. And, this anxiety can rob you so much in life. Like, and I'm going to go into a lot of different stories, because I've done a lot of research on OCD over the years, because I've suffered with it myself for many years. I've struggled with this one badly, and I've done a lot of research. I've watched a lot of documentaries about it. I've seen I've read a lot of books about it, and there's so many extreme examples, but they're things that I could personally relate to, and other people who have suffered with it have told me stories as well about what it is a coping mechanism. So your brain is telling you that you won't survive unless you do this particular activity. And sometimes, like, if you're in a relationship with somebody who's got OCD and suffers from that, it drives you crazy. I mean, you go berserk trying to explain to this person, you don't have to wash your hands one more time. You're fine. And that can become a source of a lot of tension. Like can be a lot of marriages that suffer. And it takes a lot of patience to be with someone who suffers from OCD. because, you know, it's easy to lose your temper and to start screaming at that person and like, stop it. But that tension actually makes things worse. It makes their anxiety go up because, again, the source of anxiety is the drive to survival, and that feeling of anger and rage and fighting, again, increases that sense of danger, which causes the person to go back to the thing that their mind tells us will make them safer. And they'll keep doing it and keep doing it and keep doing it. They'll keep washing their hands and keep washing their hands. They'll, so, like, there's all these very strange examples of rituals that people will go through that really don't make any sense. And remember that because anxiety comes from that, you know, those survival mechanisms being messed up, those survival mechanisms came from our ancient ancestors. So they're buried real deep in us. So they exist in our subconscious. And you got to understand, there's a real big difference. There's a real divide between the subconscious and the conscious. So the subconscious is where your inner desires are, and you're not even thinking about those. And often in dreams, you know, we refer to dreams as the subconscious state because the things that are buried down in there, our deepest, darkest feelings, our resentments, our angers towards people from the past, things that we're not thinking about during the day, live and dwell like monsters. They're like sea monsters deep in the bottom of the ocean living inside of us. And in our conscious brain, up at the top, you know, we're just going through our day-to-day routine. We're not really thinking about it. And then sometimes those monsters will come out. They come out, you know, during our dreams. And so we tend to think that OCD is genetic because usually we'll look at, for example, our parents. Parents with OCD tend to have children with OCD. And we'll say, well, look at my parents. I'm just like them, you know. But I don't think, to my knowledge, there's no evidence that OCD is genetic. It's purely a learned trait. So you develop OCD because you see your parents have it, not because there's anything genetically disposed in you towards it. So you grow up with a situation where your parents are always doing that, or it could be that you have a traumatic childhood, and that's actually the big one that I've really been trying to hammer home with these videos is the dangers and the absolute damage of child abuse and understanding what it can cause, you know, the permanent damage it can cause in a human when they're abused as a child as they grow up. So childhood trauma can be and is often the source of obsessive compulsive disorder. So the trick with OCD is identifying the cause, and it's never an easy thing to do because, you know, the thing about psychology is when you study the human mind, you look at why do we do the things that we do. Usually we're directed by our subconscious, but not our conscious. So we're not aware of the dark forces inside of us that compel us to do the strange things that we do. So in your subconscious, you might remember that traumatic childhood event, but in your conscious mind, in your day-to-day mind, you're not thinking about it. But that subconscious memory is driving you over and over and over again to do these things. And you may not even remember the memory consciously anymore. That's why, and I'm against hypnosis, by the way, but people use techniques like that to try to find that thing that's hidden in the subconscious somewhere to try to bring it out so they can identify it. And identifying the root cause of your obsessive compulsive disorder is very important in treatment. It's very strange how analogous the brain is. And I'll use a specific example. Because really, with something like this, you know, I'm talking about all this crazy psychobabble, but the best way to get things like this across is to look at specific examples and, you know, see if you can identify it. So I remember one case that I studied where this person had, you know, he was talking to a therapist, and he said he had severe obsessive compulsive disorder, but couldn't figure out why. And his compulsion was very strange because what he would do is he had his television and his DVD player set up. And for some reason, he was always convinced that the connection wasn't good enough, even though it was good enough. So he was convinced that the TV wasn't hooked up right with his DVD player. So he'd get up and he would go and he would just make sure that DVD player in that TV were connected right. He would push on it a little bit just to make sure. Then he'd sit down, but he couldn't enjoy himself. He couldn't enjoy the television, and his mind would force him to get up and go back and walk over to the other side of the room and make sure that connection was right. And then he'd go and he'd sit down. But once again, over and over and over again, his brain was telling him, what if the signal's not good enough? And again, it's amazing how ritualistic. It's almost like a religious ceremony, like crossing yourself at mass or something like that. How the person who suffers from it will go through these routines, and they have to do the routine exactly right. And he'd get up over and over again, and he'd go and check that connection. And so the therapist obviously was asking him a lot of questions about his childhood to dig deep into his subconscious to find out what happened. And at first the guy was in total denial. Then again, that's the conscious brain. The guy was like, no, I had a happy childhood. No, nothing bad happened to me when I was a kid. And after some digging and forcing the guy to be honest with himself, he eventually admitted that his parents fought a lot. They divorced at a young age. He was neglected and not protected by his sister or his mother. And his father bullied him. So his father would, make fun of him and call him fat and, make fun of his appearance. And so after a lot of digging around, what the therapist realized was that this guy, and this is where you start shedding light on it. It's like a tree. You start digging up the tree until you get to the root. And the roots, think of the ground as like your subconscious. The roots of your modern behavior, that's the top of the tree, the branches, but the roots are in your subconscious. So what the therapist found out was that this guy had... what he was doing was he desired connections with people. He desired especially connections with his sister. So his father bullied him, and his mom and his sister never did anything about it. And he never had a good relationship with them, and he still didn't. And he desired connections with people. And see, the brain works in these very almost poetic, analogous ways. And his brain was actually making him, an adult, go out and check connections, make sure the connection's right. So the connection with the DVD and the Blu-ray, the DVD player and the television, that was a modern psychological manifestation of his deep inner desires for connections. And it's just such a tangled web. It's like just this giant tangled up spider web that you have to navigate through and find out, where does this web connect and where does that web connect. And it's like the mind is like a minefield, like a psychological minefield. You're just walking through it carefully not to step on a mine and blow up. And, there's just so many complicated things that can happen throughout our lives. These experiences, they build up over time. So often there's a traumatic event or something that we're not happy about from our childhood. And it could be our own parents suffered from OCD, and they, never thought anything was clean. No matter how much they cleaned and cleaned and cleaned, they still never thought things were clean enough. And so you watch that behavior, or maybe they made you clean all the time, and they ordered you and said, clean that, clean that, clean that. And no matter how much you cleaned it, we're going to get into compulsive narcissism a little bit later towards the end. But no matter how many times the parents may have ordered the child to clean the stuff, to clean the floor, to clean the mirrors, to clean the windows, it was never clean enough. And so as an adult, that child now suffers with OCD. So OCD is a generational thing. And very often I've noticed too that when you confront people who suffer from OCD, at first they totally deny it. And they present you with a totally different story where, I don't know where my OCD came from. I don't know why I do these things. I had a great childhood. My parents loved me greatly. I've got a great relationship with my family. I don't know where it came from. And usually that's our conscious mind burying our subconscious memories. And almost all the time there's something they're not telling you, something they may not even be aware of. And getting that out of them might be kind of like digging, it's like pulling teeth. You're going to have to really sit down and psychologically analyze them and force them to admit things, and be very patient as you just sort of wrestle them to the ground and dig that traumatic memory out of them that makes them do this modern behavior. So the funny thing is that, like I said, OCD is based on real threats, usually. If you don't have a connection, let's use the connections guy as an example. If you don't have a good connection with people, you can have a shorter lifespan. Humans need connections with others. We need strong familial bonds. Parents that love us, sisters and brothers that love us, that'll be there, that'll have our backs no matter what. Those things are critical for survival in the wild, and that's why they're so important to us today, and that's why we need them. Like when you get love, when you get affection, your brain, the chemistry of your brain and your nervous system rewards you with that dopamine rush. And we need that dopamine rush to be happy, stable, healthy, and normal. And that's a classic mammalian trait. And most mammals in the animal kingdom are not solitary. They need love. They need togetherness that way. And but they are often based on real things that can be real threats. So, for example, if we go back to the classic story of the hand washer, the person who washes their hands over and over and over again, and no matter how many times they wash their hands, they feel like they're never clean. And this is one of many issues that I've personally struggled with, that it's almost amazing how your brain can hallucinate, and hallucinations happen way more often than we think. We think that hallucinations only happen when people have schizophrenia, or maybe they'll have mirages when they're lost out in the desert or whatever. But in reality, your brain hallucinates all the time, and those hallucinations can be way more pernicious than you think. So the person who's got hand washing issues, they can literally, and they can't actually, you can't feel germs on your skin. Germs are microscopic. Bacteria, there's as many people in the world as there are bacteria on one person's skin. So your skin, your whole body from head to toe, you've got about 7 billion bacteria living on the surface of your skin. And some of it's healthy, some of it's good bacteria that you need. And also being exposed to bacteria actually and viruses on a steady diet of them actually builds and strengthens your immune system, so you don't want to be completely isolated. But when someone suffers from OCD, they swear up and down they can feel the germs. They can feel those germs crawling on their skin, but you can't feel germs. It's a trick of the brain. It's actually a hallucination. It's really kind of amazing. It's one of those things about humans that just makes us so different amongst animals. Amongst any living creature on the animal kingdom is our brain's capacity to lie to us and feed us false information and convince us beyond a shadow of a doubt that those things are real. And so there's somebody who shared with me her own struggle with OCD, and I'm not going to name her name, but her problem was with door locking. And so what she struggled with was locking her doors at night. And she was absolutely convinced that somebody was going to break into the house. And, that is a real threat. That does happen. And so, again, the survival mechanism is there. It's in the right place, but it's on overdrive. So she would go around the house every night in a ritual and make sure every single door was locked. But then when she was done, she wasn't satisfied. Like something in her mind was still telling her, check again, make sure. And she would know that she knew beyond a shadow of a doubt that every single door in the house was locked, and yet she would have to go through the routine over and over again. And see, this is where it starts robbing you of your life. This is where it starts taking away everything that, you're not having a relationship with somebody. Like you might have a spouse that's in bed wanting you to come to bed, and it's like, no, I can't. I've got to check the house one more time. And when you're in a relationship with someone like that, it takes patience, because you have to understand their brain is, I hate to say their brain is messed up. Their internal survival mechanisms are left up, and their brain is telling them, that's why they get what they say, the look in their eyes, where there's no reasoning with them. You can't talk them out of it. It's because their brain is telling them that they're going to die, that their life depends on this. That's why they're getting the adrenaline rush. That's why the dopamine is rushing through their system, and they're just so driven. They're so energetic. They can't be listened to or reasoned with. They've got to go check the doors in the house one more time. And she told me something that was very interesting, that she would lay there at night and she was paralyzed. She was, she had spent hours checking every single door in the house, making sure they were all locked, and she knew they were all locked, but she would still lay there just paralyzed with terror, having anxiety, like her heart was racing. She was having chills because she knew, it's like something was telling her, what if there's one door that isn't locked, and what if a burglar is breaking in and he's going to murder the family? What if? See, that's what's so insidious about obsessive compulsive disorder. It's that what if, that voice in your head is always whispering to you, what if? And that worst case scenario, and it's like the panic starts to come in, and the brain tells you that your life depends on this. You've got to go check one more time. You've got to go check every single room in the house. Every single door you have to make sure that it's locked. But no matter how many times you make sure, you're never satisfied. Your brain is never happy with the amount of times. There's no point where you can just relax and finally go to sleep. Because it just tells you over and over and over again, every door must lock. And see, I'm a compulsive door locker when it comes to, cars, locking your car doors. And I've driven my wife crazy a couple of times because, I lock the door of the car as soon as we pull up, and sometimes I'll open the door and I'll go ahead and lock it, and she hasn't opened the door yet, and she's like, "Can you unlock the door, please?" And so we struggle with these things because, again, our brain is telling us that our survival depends on it, and so often these fears have at least a rational basis, but they go to the point where they're totally irrational. And our brain tricks us into thinking that we can actually feel the germs on our skin. No matter how many times we wash it off, no matter how many times we scrub our hands with soap and, let the water run over and wash it off, you can still feel them. But like I said, it's a trick of your brain because you can't actually feel germs. But you feel that tingling, that prickling. That's your brain actually creating the hallucination. And you're actually feeling something that isn't really there. And so, with locking your doors, there is a real fear of intruders. Intruders are bad, and intruders come into your house. They could do terrible things. They could rob you and murder your family, and it's that fear that it could happen. And so, what ends up happening? Obsessive compulsive disorder is like a voice in your head, and when I say that, I don't mean a literal voice. I'm not talking about like a schizophrenia where you audibly hear voices that aren't there, but these subconscious voices you can't really hear, and these voices work really, really fast. Usually, people who suffer from obsessive compulsive disorder have something very similar to like attention deficit disorder, where you've got 10 thoughts going on in your mind at one time. Your brain is constantly working on overdrive, and so you're thinking about 10 things at once. Like, how many hours of sleep did I get last night? Counting your steps while you walk. Thinking about what you're going to eat for lunch and then what you're going to eat for dinner, and worrying about if you're going to have a heart attack because you didn't exercise enough this morning. It's like, and all of those things, it gets overwhelming, exhausting. All those things are bombarding your mind and tumbling through your mind like clothes through a dryer over and over and over again. And so those voices in your head will bully you into doing something that you know that you don't need to do. And so that small voice inside was telling the person that suffered with the door locking problem, you've got to go check the doors and make sure that they're all locked or you're going to die. And she doesn't want to listen to that voice, but that voice is bullying her. It's threatening her. It's saying, no, you'll die if you don't listen to me. And eventually she gives up and she goes through the whole ritual of going around the house and making sure every single door is locked. And so there's another, let me move on to another example. There's a radio personality that I heard that suffered from obsessive compulsive disorder, and he was talking about his own personal examples of this. So what he did, and I thought this example, I could actually relate to this myself, which I've never done this specific. I'll get into some of my own specific problems with OCD. So, for example, this guy would be driving to work, and he would hit a speed bump, and he would actually see the speed bump, and he would slow down, and he would hit the speed bump, and he'd keep going. Now, most of us, when that happens, we don't think anything of it. But then that little small voice inside would start to get louder and say, what if that wasn't a speed bump? What if you hit a child? And he knew that wasn't true. In his conscious mind, he knew that he had hit a speed bump. But once again, that voice inside starts to bully you. It starts to threaten you. It starts to say, it starts to give you those worst case scenarios. It starts to tell you the child is dead. There's a body laying on the street and the police are looking for you, or there's ambulances everywhere. And maybe you should turn around and go back and check to make sure. But you don't want to go back and check and make sure because you know it's ridiculous. You know your brain is lying to you, but you have to do it. And you're driven by that. And eventually he would turn around. He would go back to the spot where the speed bump was. And once again, it was just a speed bump. There's no child laying there dead on the street. There's no ambulances. There's none of that stuff. All this worst case scenario that his brain told him wasn't real. So he would turn around and he'd go back and he'd head on his way back to work. But once again, the voice would start up again. But what if it was a child, not a speed bump? What if you ran over a child? And again, he would go through this whole routine again. He would turn around, drive back to the spot where the speed bump was, just to make sure that it wasn't a child laying there dead on the side of the road. It wasn't. It was a speed bump. He knew it was a speed bump. But see, what happens is, when you have anxiety, your anxiety drives you towards a certain behavior that doesn't actually fix the anxiety. So you'll think that checking it and seeing that it was just a speed bump would ease his anxiety, the anxiety attack he was starting to feel. But it wouldn't. It would temporarily. He'd feel like, okay, phew, that was just a speed bump. It wasn't really a child laying there dead. But it doesn't fix the anxiety. It's just a temporary fix. And as soon as he turns around, once again, the anxiety starts to come back, and that anxious voice starts telling him, what if you ran over a child? And he would do this 10 times. He would be late for work. He would get fired from jobs. It would ruin his life because he would spend so much time going back to check a speed bump to make sure it wasn't a dead child that he'd run over, even though he knew it wasn't. He would do it over and over and over again. He would spend hours doing this, going through this routine over and over and over again. And that's what OCD can do to you. If you have a severe case of it, it can ruin your life. It can ruin your relationships with people. It can ruin marriages. It can cause you to lose your job. It's a terrible, paralyzing thing to struggle with. And it's something we really need to take seriously. Mental health can be just as bad as physical disease. Like, if someone suffers from depression, it can be just as deadly as cancer. And we really should treat it with the utmost seriousness. And so I'll give some personal examples. Like, I can remember myself when I was very young, being in school and learning for the first time about germs, and just the absolute fear that came over me when my teachers taught me there's these things called germs, and they're small and you can't see them, but they're on the surface of everything. And so I remember my 5th grade teacher actually said, think about those children in kindergarten. They use the potty, they don't wash their hands, they've got, she didn't say dookie bacteria, but she was implying it. They've got fecal matter all over their hands, and, those kindergartners don't know what they're doing, so they're walking down the halls of the school, and they're smashing their hands and fingers and touching them, and just think of all the fecal bacteria that's growing on the surface of the wall. So don't ever touch the wall, or you could be coming in contact with that. And I remember that scaring me to death. Like, oh my God, if I touch the wall, I'm going to get a disease. I'm going to get fecal bacteria from someone else crawling all over my skin. And I became terrified of touching walls after that. And for a very long time after that, anytime I was in school, I would go nowhere near the wall. I couldn't go close to the wall. I couldn't touch the wall. If I touch the wall, I'm going to get fecal bacteria all over me. I'm going to get contaminated. I'm going to get radioactive. I can feel the cholera bacteria growing on my skin like pin prickles. You can actually feel it. And it's all an illusion. It's something your brain is telling you. Now, germs are real, obviously, but OCD is taking a real thing and just blowing it way out of proportion and going overboard with it. And then later, I started struggling with a lot of personal hygiene routines, and I still struggle with this to this day, and it drives my wife crazy. How long does it take the ordinary person to brush their teeth? I don't know, maybe a few minutes, couple of minutes, and this drives my wife crazy because when I brush my teeth before going to bed, I don't just brush my teeth. I go through a dental routine. And she'll joke that it takes me half an hour, what it takes most people to do in just a couple of minutes. But, and I've actually, it's kind of interesting because I said it goes back to trauma. So I'm going to be honest and open. When I was a child, I lost a tooth, and it was up here. It was one of my permanent teeth started to come in prematurely, and they had to surgically remove it. And because of that, my permanent teeth came in with a large gap between each one of them, and also they were very crooked, and it took years and years and years of corrective braces. But before I got the braces, I got bullied at school for it. So I'd go to school and I had the nickname Yellow Brick Tooth, and constantly I was made fun of for my big, ugly buck teeth, and I didn't make this connection until I was in adulthood, but that's around the time that my obsessive compulsive routine around my teeth started, around my dental hygiene. And so it's not enough for me to floss, but I would go back and floss and floss and floss and floss. And like the dentist would often say, "Wow, you've got the most clean teeth I've ever had." It's because I've got obsessive compulsive disorder about dental hygiene that I think most likely emerges from that trauma of being bullied as a child for my teeth, for being yellow brick tooth. I never really, I'm 36 years old and I still never overcame that nickname, yellow brick tooth. And so one thing I've also struggled with, like flossing, going back and then flossing again, and then once again going back and flossing again. And like where most people get done with flossing in just a few minutes, here I am flossing and flossing and flossing, and I go through, all of my rows of teeth, and yet still I'll go back to the beginning and start over again. And then I would go brush my teeth, and brushing my teeth was just as bad as flossing my teeth, where I would brush and then you might have missed a spot. There might be that little bit of plaque growing, and I got to go back and brush that area again. And then going back and I got to brush this area again because I might have missed a spot over here, over and over and over again. And like I said, it gets to the point where it robs you of your life. So I've struggled with compulsive hand washing. I've struggled with dental hygiene, going overboard with obsessive compulsive, tooth cleaning. What's good about that one for me is I can at least trace it back to something specific. So remember I said the important thing about OCD behaviors is you have to go back to the traumatic event from your childhood that triggered the event in the first place. And if you can expose that and then understand it, that can be your first step towards treatment and towards getting better. And I'm still not better about that, but so I could go through example after example after example, and I think you all get the point now that obsessive compulsive disorder, it robs you. If it's severe, it can rob you of your life. It can rob you of normal habits because your brain is telling you you're going to die if you don't do this ritual over and over again, and that voice in your head will bully you into doing something unnecessary, something you don't need to do. So let's talk about, this is a weird way of putting it, the dark side of obsessive compulsive disorder. The whole thing can be dark, really, but most people who have OCD just suffer with obsessive compulsive disorder. But there is a particular type of personality disorder, and it's called obsessive compulsive narcissism. And so if you go back, I've done a video about anxiety. I've also done a video about surviving abusive relationships with narcissists who manipulate you. And I recommend, if you haven't seen that, going back and watching it. And so I'm going to tie that in with this. So obviously, not everybody with obsessive compulsive disorder struggles with narcissism, but there are people with obsessive compulsive disorder that have narcissism, and actually, so an obsessive compulsive narcissist has OCD, but they use that to manipulate people and to hurt people and to do the typical things that a narcissist would do. And so having obsessive compulsive narcissist parents, the reason this is important is because that can lead to a child who grows up with obsessive compulsive disorder. So let's talk about obsessive compulsive narcissism. So the thing about narcissism is that no matter what, if you're in a relationship with a narcissistic person, nothing you do is ever good enough, and you're always wrong and they're always right, no matter what. Somehow they manage to manipulate you and create a reality where they're always right and you're always wrong. And somehow when you call them out on that, they're always the victim and you're always the bad person for that. And it can be very difficult and very abusive emotionally, mentally, not just physically. to be in a relationship, and it's a relationship of any kind. It doesn't have to be, your spouse. It could be your parents. It could be your children. It could be a sibling. It could be a coworker, a manager at work, anybody. So the obsessive compulsive narcissist, remember what I said. Obsessive compulsive disorder is about nothing ever being quite right. Like, no matter how many times you check your doors to make sure they're locked, it's never enough. No matter how many times you wash your hands, they're never clean. No matter how many times you clean, the mirror, there's always still a smudge on there somewhere. All right, so the obsessive compulsive narcissist uses that against others. So what they'll do is they will always tell you that, when you clean the mirror, they tell you that it's not good enough. And so they may have OCD, but they project that OCD onto others. So, for example, if you've got a narcissistic parent who's raising their child, he'll order his child to clean the mirror. The child cleans the mirror, and the child puts all of his effort into it, but the parent says, no, it's not good enough. You missed a spot right there. And so the obsessive compulsive narcissist focuses on the imperfections of others, is obsessed with imperfections. And so they will always point out the imperfections of the work you did. They'll always, and you're always stuck in this pattern of trying to clean as hard as you can to make it right, and they're never happy. They never tell you that it's good enough. They never praise you, and often if they're a narcissist, what they'll do is they'll then compare how you clean the mirror to how they clean the mirror. Because in a narcissist mind, they're the greatest person who ever lived. They're the smartest person. They're the most accomplished person. They have fantasies of glory and always being right and always being victorious in all that they do. And so they'll often compare you to themselves and say, well, I always clean the mirror perfectly. I always vacuum the rug and there's nothing left on it. I always wash my car. I always cut the grass and there's not a single blade of grass standing over it. And so they're constantly using that to belittle you and make you feel like you didn't measure up to their standards over and over again. And so not every narcissist has obsessive compulsive disorder, but there can be a certain type of narcissist that has it and uses that as a manipulative means to, abuse, damage, criticize the person they're in the relationship with. And those can be extraordinarily difficult relationships. So you do that to your children, and your children are guaranteed to grow up to have obsessive compulsive disorder because, there's an old saying that the way you talk to your children is the voice they'll hear in their heads all their lives. So when someone grows up to be self-critical, it's because their parents constantly criticize them. The voice of their parents in their mind is still criticizing them, and nothing they do is ever good enough. They may have had obsessive compulsive narcissists for parents. And so no matter how many times, and so, the child who grows up in a situation like that will often grow up to be a perfectionist. Everything has to be perfect. Everything has to be right. The rug always has to be straight. There can't be a single smudge left on the mirror. Every blade of grass, when I cut, the grass has to be up. There cannot be a single blade of grass left standing, a lone blade of grass out there in the freshly mowed lawn, because deep down inside in their subconscious, the voice of their parent is still there, criticizing them, telling them they're not good enough. So they're actually driven by the desire to finally get love, to finally get the approval of their mom and dad. But those are the voices in their minds, and they're invisible voices. They're hallucinogenic voices. And so this deadly cycle in adulthood is that no matter how many times, just like when they were a child, no matter how many times they cleaned stuff and it was never clean enough, in adulthood, no matter how many times they clean stuff, it's never going to change their childhood. It's never going to make their parents love them. And, it's the saddest thing when you see people who, their parents have been dead for years. There is no hope of them ever getting love, approval, and acceptance or praise for what they do from their mom and dad, and yet they're still caught in these obsessive compulsive behaviors, ritualistically cleaning the house, checking all the doors, washing their hands, over and over and over again, just trying their best deep down inside to get the love and approval and praise from their mom and dad that they now have long outgrown any hope or possibility of getting. So what are the solutions? What can we do about obsessive compulsive disorder? So the most common one is cognitive behavioral therapy. And this is a difficult one. It's really tough to unravel. And I told you all earlier that the best first step in getting out of obsessive compulsive disorder is to find the root cause of it. You know, what traumatic event, you know, what did your parents do to you, whatever it is. What is it that you're trying to overcompensate for? You know, what is it that messed up the survival mechanisms in your nervous system that is convinced you that you're going to die if you don't commit this routine over and over again? And so what the behavioral therapy will do is it will force you to confront the anxiety. So what's going on here is that if you don't do the ritual, your mind, your renal glands, your adrenaline, everything in your system tells you that you're going to die. But you have to retrain your brain to realize that you're not actually going to die. So what happens is with obsessive compulsive disorder is very often the person who suffers from it is trying to avoid the anxiety attack because their mind, the voices in their heads, their brain is threatening them and saying, if you don't do this behavior over and over and over again, you're going to suffer an anxiety attack. And anxiety attacks are unbearable. You know, like that feeling that you're going to die, your heart rate goes up, you feel flushed, you start sweating, you're grabbing yourself, you're screaming, you know, you want to pull your hair out, you're just screaming at the top of your lungs. You feel like you're dying on the inside because your brain is actually telling you you're going to die. It's the same feeling you would get like an animal that's backed up into a corner. It goes into fight or flight mode. It goes into survival mode. The animal will kill, it will scratch, it will bite, it will do anything to keep itself alive. That's what you're going through. That's what your nervous system is going through. And it's unbearable. It's painful. It's horrible. But you have to get through it. See, so what cognitive behavioral therapy does is it puts you through that anxiety attack to show you that when you get through the anxiety attack, you're okay. You're still here. You're still breathing. You're not dead. And it rewrites your way of looking. It rewires your brain to look at things where if I don't go through this ritual, I won't die. I'll be okay. I will survive this. If I don't brush my teeth time after time after time after time, you know, and if I don't do that, and if I just brush my teeth once and I start feeling that anxiety attack that is driving me to brush my teeth one more time, just in case I missed a spot, but I don't do it. And I just sit there and I let the anxiety attack happen. I let my heart rate go up. I let, you know, my eyes get big and grit my teeth and, oh my God, I'm dying. Oh, this is horrible. My life is over. But see, the thing about anxiety attacks is that it's really an empty threat because anxiety attacks don't last forever. They do subside eventually. And once the anxiety attack starts to go down, there's a sense of relief. It's like, you know, it's like an aha moment. Something in your mind will suddenly come to life and go, wait a minute, I didn't brush my teeth a second time and I'm okay. I didn't die. I'm still alive, you know? And then there's a feeling of euphoria, like a new dopamine rush, you know, that your brain can reward you with starts to come up and starts to tell you it's okay. And you can start to pursue that. And that's usually the first step. It's an ugly thing to have to go through. But the thing about anxiety is that anxiety is painful, but it's also painful to get realized. Anxiety is like vomiting. Like you're sick before you vomit. You feel sick in your stomach, but you don't want to throw up because throwing up is painful. That horrible feeling of the stuff you ate and your gastric juices coming up and, you know, getting ejected out of your mouth is just a painful thing. It hurts and it's like you feel like you're dying. It's like, bleh. But once it's over with, once you get it out of your system, you don't feel sick to your stomach anymore. That sense of relief comes over. It's like you have to jump that hurdle. You have to go through that pain and agony to get to the relief on the other side. And it's unfortunate that you have to do that, but if you're struggling with anxiety, depression, obsessive compulsive disorder, that's what you have to do. That's just the hurdle you have to jump. That's just the lot you were dealt in life to get better. And so I guess you could say that cognitive behavioral therapy is about facing your fears and realizing that you're not going to die from your fears. Like the anxiety attack has been threatening you all these years. You've been going through the compulsive rituals to avoid this anxiety attack, just let the anxiety attack happen. Stand up to it, like David going up against Goliath, and realize that it's really something that can't hurt you, even though it seems like it can. Okay, so that's obsessive compulsive disorder. I think this was a good, productive conversation. So again, I didn't really know, and I don't have a plan of how many more live streams I'm going to do on mental health, but I'm getting a lot out of this. I hope the people watching are getting a lot out of it, and I hope we're really learning stuff. And I really want us to go forward because I keep thinking up new stuff. Like, I did the first one, which is about anxiety in general, but now I can talk about other things like tonight, obsessive compulsive disorder. I mentioned that briefly in my first one, but now I could go into it a little bit more detail. And so we can talk about other things, nighttime terrors, the anxiety attacks children suffer with at night, insomnia. We can talk about anorexia, eating disorders, overeating, all these different anxiety problems that people struggle with. We can go into a lot of detail. And so I guess I'm going to go ahead and conclude there. If you came in late, again, just wait a few minutes when I stop the stream, and you can probably start over again. I think it auto plays, so you can watch this from the beginning. And thank you all again for tuning in. I'll see you next week.